Hi, everyone. I'd just like to welcome you to the latest edition of Scholarly Skills, our professional development workshop series that's being hosted by the Faculty of Graduate Studies at York for 2023-24. And of course, we're on the 24 side of things now. My name is Alice MacLachlan. I am the Vice Provost and Dean of Graduate Studies at York University. I am also a research professor at York. I work in the philosophy department. I have been a research professor there and a graduate supervisor of many, many theses and dissertations for the last 16 years. So I do come to you with two hats on, but I should also add that this time I am not coming to you alone. I am absolutely delighted to say that this Scholarly Skills will be run as a panel. I have a wonderful panel of research experts from across the university, which I will be introducing shortly. And together we will be taking your questions, many of which have been offered in advance even before the panel began, and working through from the opening stages to the final revisions, major questions about starting your first sort of significant major research project, whether that's a master's thesis, a doctoral dissertation, or some other sort of research construct at the graduate or postgraduate level. So I don't want to take up too much airtime because there are a lot of questions. So I'd like to begin by introducing you to some of the panelists. First, we have Alison Crosby. Professor Crosby is Associate Professor and Chair of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. Dr. Crosby, would you like to say a few things about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And I should just say that Alice and I started at York at the same time. So the first time we met was in a How to Be
Yeah,
a Professor at York
that's
workshop.
true.
And here we are so many years later, and we're still here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. And I look forward to trying to respond as much as possible to people's questions and concerns. So my own research uses a transnational feminist lens and participatory methodologies to accompany protagonists' multifaceted struggles to redress and memorialize colonial, racialized, gendered violence, including in Guatemala, where I've worked for over 30 years. And my work also works to critique the reification of sexualized harm, in particular within rights regimes, and how this reification travels into and often works against context-specific struggles for redress.
Thank you so much, Alison. I think that interdisciplinary research lens will be particularly useful to our participants. Second, I would like to introduce our second expert, Professor Scott McLaren, who is both an associate librarian and graduate faculty member in both histories and humanities. So we have more interdisciplinarity here. Scott, I think actually you also joined around the same time Alison and I did. So I think this is kind of a cohort. That's the word I'm looking for, a cohort reunion. But would you like to say a little bit about yourself and your research?
Sure. Thanks very much, Alice. Alice, I'm very delighted to be here with you today to talk about research and the research process. So I also wear two hats as an associate librarian for humanities and a graduate faculty member in humanities history and most recently in English as well. So my area of expertise is the history of the book and religion in the 19th century. And I have a new book coming out this spring with Bloomsbury Academic called The Bible in the Age of Empire, a Cultural History. So I'm very excited to see that come out and looking forward to your questions and comments and having a really fruitful discussion.
I'm looking forward to it as well. I think it should be incredibly promising. Now, I should add, in case you are noticing a certain disciplinary cluster here, we do have another panelist joining us. As a philosopher, I can only assume she's gotten tied up in her lab in some sort of experiment or perhaps caught in her lab coat. But Professor Dawn Basley, who is a biology professor who runs an extraordinary lab here at York, should also be joining us at some point. So perhaps if you have questions that are particularly related to starting a major research project under the auspices of uh, in the natural sciences under the auspices of a supervisor working in their lab or something like that, you're welcome to ask us about it, but we will turn to those questions when Professor Basley arrives as well. So apologies for the short delay on that front, but I have to say, I know my other two panelists and their work, and I am confident that you are in very good hands about the mechanics of a major research project, whatever your field is. So this is how I thought the webinar could go. We don't have endless amounts of time, and there are endless things you could ask about starting a big project. So as Anessa mentioned in the introduction, we have collected questions from you. We are very grateful for them. I have divided these up roughly into the very beginning stages, research methodologies and sources, planning timelines and writing, and then the hiccups, burnout, getting stuck, other issues. So I'm going to try and move us through those. And so it's a certain point say, let's move on to the next topic. But as you'll discover as you write a major research project, these things aren't linear and they don't always go as you expect. So we'll just sort of take things as they go. I have a list of questions in front of me, which was generated by you, but don't let that stop you from asking more. Just feel free to put them into the Q&A, and Anessa and I will manage them and make sure we get to as many of them as possible, or to at least as many original new questions as possible. Thank you so much. And why don't we begin at the beginning by saying, when you are thinking about a new research project, where do you two begin? Do you have any particular tips, tricks, techniques, maybe even a habit or a piece of software or something you want to pass on? Tell us how to start. Alison, should we go alphabetically?
Sure. Thanks, Alice. Well, because my research is community-based and I never do research alone, I always do research with communities, with others, with teams of people. So I always begin there, and I always begin in the relationships of accountability that I've built over time with particular communities. And I should emphasize, I know people are at different phases, from, master's to doctoral to postdoctoral, so it depends. But I think if you are working with communities, putting the time into building those relationships of trust, or just enough trust, as Patricia Maguire refers to it, because we also have to think critically about this notion of trust and what that actually means. But for me, beginning in those relationships of accountability, and if you are working with communities for your research, I think it's really important to be very clear and specific about people's roles and responsibilities. We always have an agreement that we build together through a series of workshops where we go through everything. So there's no misunderstandings about data, who owns the data, what kind of outputs are going to come from the data. And, for many of you, of course, you're focused on your dissertation or your MRP, and that's a very specific output. However, research, and especially collaborative and community-based research, can have many different outputs. So your dissertation could be one output, but there could be others. So I think if you are working with people, if you are working with communities, I think mapping out from the onset, how you're going to work together and trying to foresee as many of the possible areas of tension that can emerge, that will serve you down the line in terms of perhaps the stickiness and the trickiness of research relationships. So that would be my sort of tip for those of you who are doing community orientated research. A broader tip for everybody is to try not to do everything. I mean, especially when we do social justice orientated research, which I imagine a number of you are doing, given the sort of focus of York and our research. You kind of are focused on trying to kind of solve the world's problems, and that can seem really overwhelming. My advice is to kind of be as focused and specific as you can, because any issue that you focus on will, of course, speak to the broader context. But I think the more, and especially for an MRP, I would say as well, the more you can be focused from the beginning, the better. So doing the kind of research to figure out what's already been done, so already sort of starting your literature review process, I think is helpful, so that you can kind of narrow down and be specific. And I think that will then help guide you as you develop the project. So putting that time, we can often have anxiety about jumping into a project. And I would, I teach a fourth year undergrad methods course where we spend a whole year, the year of the course, designing a research project. And I tell people it actually how spending the time on that part is really important. It may change, of course, as you move along, but actually thinking through, how to focus, what kind of relationships you want to build, are key to the research process. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to
No, I
Scott.
love that. I love the relationality, the collaboration in your answer, and also the focus on responsibility. Thank you. Scott, what would you like to add to that?
One of the things that's so much fun about being on a panel is, especially in a cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary panel, is realizing how many principles are applicable in one set of fields are also applicable in another. So I want to pick up on some things both Alison and Alice said. First of all, one of the biggest challenges I think any graduate student faces when starting a major project is managing their anxiety about getting through the project and getting to the finish line. I think it's very important to remember as a graduate student, first of all, that the project, whatever it is, whether it's your MRP or your dissertation, is not your life's work. It's a finite project that you're going to start and you're going to finish, and you're going to be successful as a graduate student. And a good dissertation is a finished dissertation. So work towards that goal. Picking up on something Alice said, which is that research is nonlinear. So you're going to find yourself going forwards and backwards. Sometimes you're going to feel like, oh, I should be on the writing stage now, but then you realize you have to go back and do a little bit more research because you've discovered something as you're setting your ideas down on paper and you're having to confront those in a way and realizing, no, there's a bit of a gap there still. So I would say that in order to manage your anxiety, remind yourself that your research isn't going to be linear. Your progress isn't going to always look like progress, even though you're always making progress. And remember, too, that serendipity is really important when you're developing a research project. So give yourself permission to read widely and to read freely and to bring some play into the whole process. Try and have some fun with it and follow your heart. You need to find something that's going to be interesting enough to you to sustain you for a number of years as you complete the project. So don't just grab onto the first thing you think is practicable. Give yourself that permission to play around. And something else Alison said, which really struck a chord with me, was this idea of relationships and accountability and community. And you might think, well, how is that relevant in the humanities when chances are you're studying an event that took place a very long time ago or people who have been dead for centuries? The thing is, even in humanities scholarship, you are entering into relationships and communities with other scholars who are interested in your subject as well. And so you want to work on cultivating those relationships, getting to know people in your field, reaching out, participating in scholarly societies if you can. And don't be shy about contacting people who are working in your field, who are experts about what it is that you're working on, and send them an email, introduce yourself, and ask for their advice. And that way you can make a connection. You can probably also get some really good advice on how you can develop your project in a way that is workable, but also, as Alison said, sufficiently focused that you'll be able to get across the finish line.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I love the themes that are developing. I'm going to pick up on one more aspect of relationality for beginning and say you may be starting a relationship with the people who are implicated by your research subjects, by the other people in the field, by potential supervisors, advisors, interlocutors. There's one more person you're developing a relationship with, and that's actually your future self. One of the things about a major research project is it takes major time, and you will change and grow over that time. And you will forget things that you read now. You will forget ideas that you had, or wherever you will forget the particular positionality that led you into the topic, because the topic will change you and the research will change you. And so one of the things that I learned to do too late that I find really useful is to start research as if I am leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for my future self, so that I can follow my way back to what I was thinking about, so things don't tend to get lost. And this may depend a little bit on who you are and what you need. It may be that my fellow panelists don't need this kind of breadcrumb trail, but I do find I I often reinvent my own wheel 3 or 4 times over the course of a major research project, thinking I've had the same idea, rediscovering the same PDF, only to find that it's in a file called sources or something like that on my computer. So whether that is starting starting as a tarot folder or just an Excel spreadsheet or something on your computer or a notebook, starting to keep something like a research journal that is a little bit what you're thinking about and where your ideas are going, but also just what you read, where you looked, what database you used, who you had conversations with, who you reached out to. That research journal can be invaluable to you. And it will also help contribute to some of the shaping and the focus that my fellow panelists have talked about. So talk to your participants, talk to your fellow colleagues, advisors, but talk to your future self as well. So let's jump in to talk about the topic. We've already had this sort of question emerging a little bit because Alison has talked about shaping the topic and so on. But do you have pointers for how to develop a topic? And I think this goes hand in hand with sort of for people who don't have a supervisor before they arrive in their program or expected to find it at York, how do you go about shaping that alchemy, the sort of triangulation of topic, supervisor, and question? Do you have any thoughts about how to take on this process? Whoever would like to speak first, go ahead.
I'll jump in, Alison, just because you were on the hot seat the first time around. The the early stages of research when you're developing your topic, one of the things that I really try and impress on students wearing my librarian hat is that the databases, the library catalogs, Google Scholar, whatever tool it is you're using for your research, you have to remind yourself that you're not just using it as a tool to find things. You're using it as a tool to help you eavesdrop on a conversation that scholars are having about what it is that is of interest to you. And so you can use these tools, these databases, as a way of sharpening your thinking and focusing your subject. So when you're developing a topic, you have to remember that you're not just identifying something that's going to be intrinsically interesting to you and you alone. Your research is taking place within the context of a pre-existing scholarly conversation. And so you need to become aware of how other academics and scholars are talking about what it is that you're interested in, because you're going to obviously approach your subject through their voices, right? That you're going to make a unique contribution to that conversation, but you need to be aware of what other people have said for two reasons. You don't want to reinvent the wheel, of course, but also you need to find a way to make your research relevant and interesting to other scholars in your field, right? So that they're going to pick up on that. And together with those scholars, you can advance that overall conversation. So when you're looking at results, you go into a database and you type in some keywords and you're looking at results, don't think of those as just dry, dead documents that are sitting out there that you can cite as authorities to help bolster your argument. Remember that each one of those is the result of someone's hard work. There's a human being behind that, or a set of human beings behind those documents, human beings you can connect with, but also remember that they're developing as scholars as well. They're contributing to the conversation, and in that sense they're your models. So, and again, going back to that idea of playing as well, when you go in and you're developing your topic, allow yourself the freedom to do a very broad search and see what strikes you, see what jumps out at you. Let the research process be a process of discovery and surprise, and not just an exercise in confirmation bias.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you. Alison, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I won't repeat anything that Scott just said. It's all great. I think also this might seem, self-explanatory, but use the structures that we have in place at York. So use your courses, and if you're doing, a PhD, use your comps process effectively to kind of get you to the stage of a of a focused topic. So, often, and I find that with students who come in, to work with me at York and have a particular topic, but then of course they take courses and they're like, oh, I've just thrown my topic out the window because of this course I took or that course I took. So, use the courses to kind of, it's a chance to dialogue with professors and your peers and to have those conversations that should hopefully help frame where you're going to go with your topic. And the methods course, I mean, I realize this is sort of depends on the discipline that you are in, but in my school program, we do have methods courses where really, again, it is a space, again, for you to work in dialogue with your peers to start to shape your project. And then, of course, the comps process is, again, comps varies. And I know I'm on a number of different graduate programs at York, and I have to reread the guidelines each because they're all very different. It's amazing the kind of the differences we have across disciplines at York. But again, I think the comps process is helping you refine your topic, do that kind of work around, the conceptual work, the broader theoretical work, as well as the more focused work that you need to do. And then I often find that students then take too long between finishing their comps because it feels like such a huge thing and getting the dissertation proposal done. And I always encourage people to use the momentum from the comps to move immediately as quickly as possible into the dissertation proposal stage and kind of not get stuck and bogged down at that stage, because I don't, again, different programs have different proposal requirements, and some are more onerous than others, but I do kind of urge that from course to comps to proposal, kind of to use the momentum. We have designed kind of building blocks that don't always work, and I acknowledge that for some people. And then in terms of sort of at what stage do you get a supervisor? I would say as soon as possible, but with the caveat that, having a focused enough topic to be able to talk to people, because when people are kind of making the decision about whether to supervise, speaking personally, I'm trying to assess whether I'm the right person, whether I have the appropriate capabilities to be able to supervise you. So I need to know enough about your project to be able to make that decision. But I think it's that relationship that's key, because then the supervisor will then work with you in terms of pulling the rest of the committee together and doing that initial kind of drafting and honing. And it is such a key relationship that I would urge people to do it as quickly as possible, but with as focused enough topic that folk can make an informed decision if they haven't already agreed. I mean, I do have students who come in to York because I've agreed to work with them. So that's a different kind of relationship.
Okay, since we are missing our third panelist, I'm going to talk a little bit more than I originally intended to. And I'm going to try and wear my sort of dean hat this time to encourage you. I guess this is following up on what Alison said, but I really encourage you not to be afraid to learn as much as possible about the structure and scaffolding of your program, which they are obligated to put on the program website. And at FGS, that's the Faculty of Graduate Studies, one of our jobs is to check and make sure they have governance documents, that they have program milestones, that what they do demand of students matches what they say they demand of students on the website. It is, for example, in the Faculty of Graduate Studies, we have requirements around what a dissertation proposal should look like, what a length of a dissertation should be, what different formats are available for dissertations and theses. It is worth familiarizing yourself with the nuts and bolts stuff. So some of that can be done on your program website or on the Faculty of Graduate Studies website. Listen, I'm not going to show up and pretend that it's easy to find things at any large institution. Don't be afraid to Google and just add York afterwards if you're looking for it. That's not necessarily a criticism of York, that's just size. But do look there. And also, I think sometimes when you arrive at graduate student at school and you're suddenly part of a community of scholars, it can be hard to admit you don't know anything and you don't know how to begin. And I just want to encourage you to shake that off. Alison already said we started at the same time. If I could go back and ask 25 more questions of everybody I met the first year I was a prof, I would do that. I wish I hadn't been so afraid to show how much I didn't know. I'm a new dean right now, and one of the things I'm letting myself do is ask questions in every meeting. And so I want to encourage you to try and do the same thing. You know, the nicest prof in a course in your first year, don't be afraid to mentally appoint them your your sort of mini unofficial advisor. Go into their office hours and ask really basic questions. If you are in science or engineering and you've arrived in a lab, look around and find the nicest person in the lab, whether it's an experienced PhD student, a postdoc, someone working as a technician of some kind, and ask them questions. Like if they've been around for a while, they may see how people parcel out parts of the supervisor's research and figure out where they fit in. Ask questions about co-authoring practices, about how you end up joining on to someone's research and picking out a part for yourself, you know, what the standard expectations are. It sounds so obvious, and I know it's probably advice as TAs that you're giving your students, but don't be afraid to ask, and don't be afraid to look, and don't be afraid to treat it like something really basic. I have to figure out a topic. That means I need a research question. The research question has to be original, but not so original that I'm not part of that conversation that Scott described. It has to be scholarly, but not so scholarly that it doesn't in some way do something for the world, for those, especially for those of us who have social justice commitments, like Alison talked about. And so the more you are narrowing it down to these very basic questions, well, you know, what interests me? What could I imagine myself writing about for 3 years? What are people in this field talking about, or where is the work being done? Like, what are the applications right now? And then verbalize it to other people. Go into that unofficial advisor's office. I was the graduate program director for philosophy until I became dean. And people who didn't work in my area would come in my office just to sort of spitball and workshop something they were thinking about doing. And you can do that with your GPD if you have a good feeling for them. Or if you don't have a good feeling for your GPD, find the person you do have a good feeling with. But don't be afraid to admit you are going through the process of working out a topic, because whether or not they admit it, it is something everyone is doing or has had to do. And it's okay to do it overtly in a nuts and bolt way, and you'll get there. And on that inspiring note, maybe we should move on to talk about the actual research. So I imagine the three of us use different research methods. I mean, we've already established a wide range of research methods just in our talking. And if Dawn were here, we would be adding to that even further. We would be discussing sort of science versus social sciences, qualitative versus quantitative methodologies, sort of working in a lab versus working with collaborators versus working in a library on your own. But we still do have some diversity of experience and background. So maybe I want to start actually by asking Scott to take off one hat and put on another. Could I invite you as a librarian in particular to say a little bit about what research resources are available in the library? I know you work in particular specializations, but maybe across the board as well as in your area. What do you recommend for students starting out?
Okay, yeah, that I'm really happy to answer that. So first of all, I just want to put in a little plug for the fact that there are these people in the library who call themselves librarians, and many of them have a subject background and subject expertise, and they're also people that you can schedule appointments with, bounce ideas off of, get some advice on how to start the research process, what databases might be the best, most fruitful ones to look into. I want to say a couple things about two resources in particular that will be relevant regardless of your discipline. The first and I would say most important one, and if you're new to graduate studies, it might be entirely new to you, is a database called ProQuest Dissertations and Theses. And you can access that from the library's homepage where it's got the little Omni search box. Just type in ProQuest, all one word, dissertations and theses. That is a really important tool as a graduate student. So what that gives you access to is mostly PhD dissertations, but some MA work as well, done around the world in full text back to 1997. And dissertations are a particular genre of writing. You need to write a dissertation to get a PhD degree, and they're very long. They can be extremely boring if you're outside the field, but they're very detailed and they're written for a small audience of specialists. So when a PhD is defended, there will be 5 committee members who will examine the student on his or her work, and assuming everything is good and the dissertation passes, it will end up in ProQuest dissertations and theses. So these documents are valuable for lots of different reasons. I mean, they're all written on the cutting edge of research, right? So they're advancing that conversation, but they contain literature reviews, which can be really helpful for you as you're writing your own literature review or you're trying to get your bearings within the field. And remember that a good literature review isn't a thinly disguised annotated bibliography. A good literature review is a verbal map to the field. It shows patterns. It shows how different schools exist alongside each other, who's in agreement with whom, who is in disagreement. And then it also highlights gaps within that conversation, gaps within our understanding. And that's where the graduate student will be making, their contribution to that conversation. So all dissertations will have some form of literature review in them. Now, they don't all have excellent literature reviews. They will vary, but they will all have something that acknowledges they're making that contribution to that conversation. So if you can find a dissertation in or near to your area that's relatively recent and has a good literature review, that can give you that map to the field that you're going to need in order to do your work. And then you're not starting completely from scratch. At least, you may need to adjust it, update it, add some additional material, but that literature review can help orient you within your area of study. The other thing, and I guess this is probably speaking more as a humanities person, but dissertations tend to be fairly heavy on theory as well. And so if you're looking for a theoretical lens for your research, dissertations would be very helpful in identifying key theorists who would be relevant to your work. Sometimes in the humanities anyway, really good dissertations get turned into books. You might think, well, I don't need to look at the dissertation because I already have the book. No, you do need to look at the dissertation, because when a dissertation is turned into a book, it is changed quite significantly. And 2 of the things that most publishers don't want to include in a published book is a literature review and a lot of theory. Literature reviews, publishers at least think, are boring, so they don't want them in their books because they're not going to help their book sell. And theory ages a book. So generally speaking, they want that minimized. So and also tons of footnotes in dissertations. I mean, people can labor over footnotes for a whole day writing a single footnote. And then when you revise your dissertation into a book, they say, cut that out. It's very hard to do, but it will still be in the dissertation. So go back to those dissertations. Obviously, I can wax poetic on this topic for a very long time, so I'm just going to very quickly say the second database that you should consult, and one that you won't readily find on any of our research guides, is called Scholars Portal Journals. It's an aggregator of journal articles, and there are millions of full-text journal articles in it across disciplines. One of the most interesting things you can do sometimes as a graduate student is bring a conversation that's happening in one discipline into dialogue with a conversation that's happening in another discipline. And if you use an interdisciplinary database like Scholars Portal Journals, you'll get that material together in a single set of results. And then you can start building the intellectual connective tissue to join those conversations together. So that is a really huge and useful place to start your research. ProQuest dissertations and theses, and Scholars Portal journals.
Thank you. Alison, so we've had our excellent librarian sort of tell us about the sources that are out there and sort of cover what is often a chapter, the literature review. I would love to be able to move to sort of talking about methods, methodologies, what those chapters look like. Do you have anything you would be able to reflect on from your practice and background or advice?
Yeah, and just a shout out again to the library, building what Scott said, and for those of you who are working in the area or using or want to use digital methodologies, which is becoming more and more it's an emerging area, certainly in my field, but many others. We have an excellent set of librarians who do digital methodologies workshops and labs, and I really I've been working with them with my classes, but I strongly urge you to reach out to folk there, because there's amazing sets of resources and constantly evolving sets of resources. Again, if you plan to do research with people, paying attention to the ethics process and building enough time. I mean, we're going to talk a bit more about timelines in a minute, but building enough time in for the ethics part of the process is incredibly important. And, you know, it's not just to tick the institutional boxes and to kind of protect the institution. It's, again, back to what I said before, if you're doing research with people, allowing the time to build the parameters of the research and to lay the groundwork for whatever methods that you're going to be doing, whether it's using participatory methodologies like I do, but even interviews or focus groups or whatever, you need to build in enough time for the ethics process. Alice, you also kind of asked questions sort of about the dissertation and the outline and the writing. A tip I always give to my students when it comes to starting the writing process, which can always feel so daunting, is most people tend to start with the literature review, which is fine as an approach. But what I find is folk often tend to get lost in the literature review and what other people are saying. So my advice is to start with your own data and to work on the chapters that, you know, with the data that you have generated. You may have the literature review, you know, mapped out in advance and have that done. But I think beginning from where you are and from your contributions then helps you shape your project and not get lost in sort of what everybody else is doing. So that tends to be, it doesn't work for everyone. And, you know, each project, and I imagine, you know, given the number of folk that we have here, you're all coming from so many disciplinary approaches and will be using different methods. And so there's not kind of a one size fits all approach to this. But I do think starting from what you're contributing also helps sustain you in the project and sustain your focus and the threads that you want to weave through the dissertation. So that's, I think I've forgotten the other questions that you asked, Alice, but feel free to prompt.
That's okay. That was lovely. Actually, it inspired me. I remembered way back in the day, my supervisor had a practice of making each of us who were his supervisees write a chapter of our dissertation that was not the literature review before we were even allowed to defend our proposal. He said, before you put it together, make sure you actually like writing about this topic. So just, it's a very rough draft. You probably won't be able to use much of it, but make sure you could sit down and write 30 pages, whether it's about your original contribution, sort of your takes, something about it, but just anything but the literature review to make sure you enjoy this enough that you want to start a proposal. Now, you know, as with everything, your mileage may vary. Your supervisor may have a very different approach. As I've already mentioned, my background is philosophy. It does tend to be more insulated in sort of one's conversation with interlocutors than other forms of research. So there is that too. Keep in mind. But I like that idea. I like the idea of not getting sort of, you are both participating in a conversation and crafting your contribution to it. And that can be a little bit of a balance. And make sure you don't find yourself falling too much into the what's happening even to the eavesdropping, so that you don't craft your contribution. And make sure you don't spend all your time crafting your contribution so you forget to look and see that the topic hasn't changed. I have a very specific question about research that is emerging. So we are being live on YouTube as well as in this webinar. And from YouTube, we have a question about incorporating AI into our major research projects. This is obviously very much the question du jour. And it's something that's interesting because very experienced research specialists and brand new PhD students are confronting it in real time together with similar levels of experience and knowledge. So that makes it quite an exciting challenge and opportunity. I am going to say before I turn to the panelists that this is something that a really wonderful working group at York talking about pedagogies of AI as exploring, and that I imagine some guidelines will be coming out from York very soon. In the meantime, because all resources are good resources, I encourage you to take a look at the FAQs for the use of AI in graduate dissertations and research posted on the University of Toronto's website. These are very helpful. And my main takeaway from them is make sure to treat AI like a source that you can talk about, refer to, defend your use of to your supervisor, your external examiner, your committee. Like, don't do anything you can't explain and defend. And if you can explain and defend it, that makes it a really interesting, legitimate research tool. But I want to turn it over to the two of you. Alison, have you been using AI? Have you been thinking about it? Are your students using it? Is this something that has come up for you?
No, I have to say I'm sort of at the very much the incipient learning part of this, so I will
That's
defer
okay.
to Scott. I'm picking up the tips. I'm trying to think about how to kind of productively use it in my teaching and perhaps in my methods course, but I haven't kind of gotten to that stage. So I'm open to all suggestions and learning along with everybody else.
Scott, I know you have been using it. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your thinking?
Yeah, I'm enthusiastically interested in AI, and particularly the AI in the form of the large language models like the one put out by OpenAI, ChatGPT. I taught a graduate course last term in the English department. It was like a methods course, and we had one class set aside to talk about that. And it was really interesting because I think there is a lot of anxiety among students and faculty about these tools and what is an appropriate use and not an appropriate use. And I think that as a general principle, it's good to practice full disclosure with your supervisor about how you're using it or how you're thinking about using it. I use it quite a lot as a brainstorming tool. I've got a subscription to GPT-4, and I've got the app on my phone, so I can just talk to it, and it talks back to me, and I can say, so I'm got a sabbatical coming up, and I'm going to be working on a new book about early book production in monastic contexts in like the late Roman Empire, and so I can sort of throw ideas at chat about that and say, well, what about this? What about that? Do you think this could work? And it's not so much that chat's giving me great ideas, but what chat's doing is it's helping me develop my own ideas by steering me off in other directions or giving me suggestions about things I haven't thought of before. It's sort of like talking to somebody who just has a really broad background in different areas. And, I, I mean, I know chat can write as well, but I don't really use it like that. I use it, sometimes I'll use it to proofread something for me. But I do find it's really useful for generating new ideas and brainstorming. And you can ask it things like you can ask it to impersonate figures as well. You can say, well, if you were for Foucault, how would you write about this? And so then chat will bring in a lot of Foucault's ideas to bear on whatever subject, and then you can use that as sort of a springboard to launch you off in a new direction. So I think it's exciting. I think that it's fun to experiment, but I do think it's very important to be transparent with your supervisor and other people you're working with about what you're planning to do with it.
Thank you for that. That is actually quite inspiring. I actually have a question for you, Scott, and it's about the limit of my knowledge. My understanding is that it's very good to sort of engage with ChatGPT if that works for you in sort of this kind of question, but to be careful in how much of your own work, especially that is not yet published, that you put into it in order to generate these conversations.
Mhm.
Because are there some concerns with sort of then your work being part of the engine that may get taken up for others or something like that? Do graduate students have any worries around that? Do you know?
I do think that is an issue. Certainly anything you put into the prompt, you can also upload large PDF documents and papers and Word documents for chat to read. But anything you upload there, you are essentially giving it to OpenAI. So you need to be very careful about that. I think, that, again, that's why it can be a fun tool to just verbally interact with if you have the app on your phone, because then you're not actually dealing with uploading large documents to it. Something else, too, that people have been very concerned about is asking chat to produce citations to scholarship and literature, and it does sometimes hallucinate. Although that was more of a problem with version 3.5 than it is 4. And so, that's something. I mean, the thing we all need to remind ourselves is that this tool is as dumb right now as it will ever be. It's only going to get better over time, and I think that's why we need to really grapple with it and come up with guiding principles as an institution, so that students and faculty don't feel like we're sort of groping around in the dark.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Was actually personally helpful as well as everything else. I just want to say again, I hope this demonstrates that one is always in some ways a beginner at research. Like every research project I start feels like the first research project because everything is different. And that's, why we're all lucky to be doing what we're doing. It's what makes it so exciting, but it can be humbling. I'm aware that we are running close to the end of our time. So I had a section on planning, timelines, and writing. Many of the questions that came in that were more information ones that can be on the website. So if you are concerned about the length of your major research project, your thesis or dissertation, I encourage you to look at the Faculty of Graduate Studies guidelines, but also to talk to your particular program. If they don't have specific guidelines on the web, it's probably because it isn't down to a word count, but there's some other consideration. So I encourage you to talk to your supervisor if they are not forthcoming, that informal advisor I mentioned, the graduate program director, or even more experienced graduate program students in your program to find out these sort of more nuts and bolts information. Same with citation practices. These will also vary by field. So I don't want to sort of tell you, I mean, I can tell you what my favorites are and which journals annoy me because they don't use them, but that is only going to be about me. That's not going to be about your dissertation. So I encourage, I'm going to save those for your own research. But I think I want to talk a little bit about getting stuck. So we have a couple of questions about getting stuck. One is just, how do you cope with burnout? And another was, what do you do if you realize a particular project or question or supervisor relationship isn't working out? What should you do? So I'm going to let you each choose to answer either or both of those with your own personal wisdom. And anything else you want to sort of add in our final few minutes, we can hopefully just go a couple minutes over the hour if we need to. But Alison, why don't I start with you? Burnout, what feels like a dead end, the need for a left turn for some reason. What do you do?
Yeah, and it's so common that for people to feel stuck. And I think the first, it comes back to the relationship with your supervisor. And of course, a couple of things. We'll get to the second question where things get more tricky, but I do, because I know it is about building a relationship, right? As you would with your, if you're doing community-based research or with anyone, it's about building that relationship. So I would encourage, the more from the beginning you can be in touch regularly and build that conversation with your supervisor, the better, because that way you are, you're building a more in-depth relationship where you both feel more comfortable having the more difficult and tricky conversations. So the sort of the first kind of point of contact, of course, should be the supervisor. But also, I mean, Alice, you mentioned, the GPD. GPDs play an incredibly important role, and they're really most often are great problem solvers as well. So I would advise people sooner rather than later to reach out if you need help. I mean, this is always what I say to my students. And I know it's hard to do that for a number of reasons, but the longer you don't reach out, the more it seems like it's becomes a bigger and bigger issue, and you get more and more stuck. So if you can reach out to somebody to begin a conversation about how to problem solve, whether it's getting stuck, whether it's needing a different path to go, whether it's you need to change your supervisor, which does happen. My one piece of advice is, as much as possible, to have, if you can, to have that conversation with your supervisor if you're feeling that you need to change that relationship. I would hope that most people, in the supervisory position, I'm speaking personally here, would not take it personally and understand that sometimes it's important to change that relationship. If you feel you can't have that relationship, that conversation with your supervisor, then reaching out to the GPD would be the next step. And again, if there's some issues there, Alice, I'm sure there are folk in FGS also, and resources in FGS. Reach out to Alice. Yes, I mean, it's the more you can rely on, that's what we're here for, I would say. And the more you can rely on the fact that we're here and those relationships that you have built, the better. And my advice would be, if you're feeling stuck, reach out sooner rather than later, because staying in that stuckness, as we all know, and we've all been there, is a really difficult and demoralizing place to be. And we do have resources to help you get unstuck. So that would be my advice on those fronts.
That was great. I'm going to jump in just before we end with you, Scott, and say, because again, our wonderful science colleague couldn't join us, I just want to emphasize, I know that for people who come through someone's research funding attached to a particular lab, whose identity at York is very much through their supervisor, with their supervisor, under their supervisor's project, I know it can feel like you have fewer options or no options, and there's a tendency not to reach out as a result. I would actually say those material conditions make it more important that you reach out early, not less. Obviously, yes, there are sort of complicated, yes, it is more complicated if you come as part of a particular project than if you just sort of show up at York and it's completely open who you're going to work with and what you're going to do. I mean, in some ways, it's easier. If things work out, you're already ahead of the game. If things don't, then there's more of a turn needed. But no matter what your situation is, there are resources for you at York. So, talk to your supervisor first. I think I'm great. I know I'm not everybody's cup of tea. Personally, in my research methods, in my approach to feedback, in what has been sometimes been described as just a dash of toxic positivity, like it's not going to be for everybody. And I hope most supervisors are like that. If they're not, turn to your GPD, turn your graduate program director, your chair if necessary. Again, that prof who taught you in a first year course that really worked for you. If that doesn't work, reach out to us at FGS. We have resources as well, to direct you to places, to hear you. I don't want you to think of it as like telling FGS on your supervisor or something like that. We can just mediate conversations. We can let you know your options. We can break through your options related to your funding, your academic progress. We can help you understand the picture and make really informed choices. But mostly what I want to emphasize is those of us who get involved and really involved in graduate supervision and research, and that is everybody on this panel, we do it because we really care about this kind of mentoring. And so even if the first person or the second person you talk to doesn't seem able to help, there may be others who can. So don't be afraid to keep reaching out. And even if your supervisor is a lovely duck and it's all good and you're just feeling burnout, don't be afraid to reach out more for that too. All right, I will step off the soapbox and pass things over to Scott for our final word. What do you do when things aren't going well?
Well, I'm going to just jump back right on the soapbox because I want to say something that I think is this is the most important thing that you need to remember. Keep the lines of communication open with your supervisor all the time. Your supervisor, I can tell you right now, wants you to succeed. I can also tell you almost certainly your supervisor is too busy with too much on his or her plate. So if you don't keep the lines of communication open, then it's unlikely your supervisor is going to take the initiative and reach out to you and make that contact. It might happen, but it might easily not happen. So really, you need to make yourself heard. And even if you think everything is going great, you still need to meet with your supervisor. I have regrettably seen students who have gone off, disappeared. These weren't my students, but I was on the committee. They go off and they do all their work, and then they come back and they say, I'm done. And that's when everyone says, you know what? This isn't really ready for showtime. And if that student had been in touch with the supervisor all the way through, this wouldn't have happened. So you need to stay in touch with your supervisor. If you're doing your PhD, you also need to stay in touch with all your committee members. Everyone needs to see your work as you're producing it. That's my approach. That way, there's no surprises at the end. I think that's the best way to proceed. Also, as the graduate student, you are in the driver's seat. You decide if that relationship with the supervisor is going to continue. You also decide if those committee members are going to continue. You might, for instance, have committee members who get you through the comps. And then after you finish your comps, you might want to shake things up a bit for your examination committee. That's totally fine. No one's going to take it personally if they get asked to step off your committee, so you can bring somebody else on, especially if your interests are sort of evolving as you're going along, or you're realizing you just click with some people better than you click with other people. But most importantly, keep the lines of communication open with your supervisor, even if you think you're not stuck.
Oh, that's fantastic. And then just on a personal note, figure out what works for you for mental health while you're writing. I was in a long distance relationship during my PhD. It was during the early days of Skype. Sometimes we would just keep the Skype window open on the corner of my screen so I wouldn't be alone in the room with my dissertation. Maybe for you, it's a cat, a sport, a hobby. There are video games, there are no wrong answers, but figure out what you like doing besides your dissertation. Make sure you do it a little bit of the time. Figure out people you like spending time with who aren't your own brain, your particular lab mates or your supervisor. Spend a bit of time with them. It's hard what you're doing. It's a wonderful, unbelievable privilege, and it's really hard and demoralizing sometimes. So we have a health and wellness and counseling at FGS. There are lots of services available across campus. Please don't be afraid to avail yourselves of them. And I think on behalf of all the panelists, I just want to say good luck. I'm so excited for each of you and your projects. I'm sure they're going to be wonderful, and I can't wait to see them. So thank you. Thank you so much for participating in this Scholarly Skills.